Jonah chapter 1, verse 17. Now the Lord provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. We normally say that there's an elephant in the room, don't we? And actually, in this case, it's a great big fish or a whale. What do we do with the idea of a great big fish swallowing a person? If you've been brought up in church, you might have been shaped by all sorts of kids' stories and particularly kids' artwork, sometimes with Jonah floating around in a rowing boat in the fish's stomach, looking over the edge, wondering whether he's going to get out of trouble, all of that kind of stuff. And we can get so distracted by this idea of a great fish that we lose the sense of what's actually being said. Because whether it's a miraculous event which allows Jonah to live for 3 days in the belly of a fish, or whether he dies and lives again and is resurrected, both of those views are relevant to the text. There is something that is just way more important. And it's quite simply this. What is being portrayed in this chapter is the idea of somebody entering the grave, somebody dying. Jonah's dead here. He's gone. He's finished. He's done for this world. And fundamental to this chapter is this question. In fact, I would go so far as to say the whole of the Bible from beginning to end rests on this one question. Can God raise the dead? Everything rests on that. The whole of the Bible from beginning to end rests on that question. Can God raise the dead? And more than that, what's it got to do for you and me? And what are the circumstances in which God will raise somebody from the dead? Let's remember the context, shall we? Jonah, we saw over the past couple of weeks, he's been told to go to this terrifying nation, the city of Nineveh, and to preach about the God of the Hebrews to them. Even more than that, he's been told to go and tell them that God's going to destroy their great city. The most powerful city that was known in the world at that time, from what we're given to understand. Jonah's got to go there. He's got to say, my God is going to destroy you. Every indication is that Jonah isn't bothered about his own life, but he just doesn't think that God should do that. These terrible people, I know what God's like. I know he's the kind of God that might do something different. That's what comes out later on. But what we talk about, what we see here is we see Jonah, he's grappling with this question. He says, I'm out of here, I'm gone, I'm running the other way. He gets on a boat, sailing away in the opposite direction. And the soldiers we saw last week, something I'd never really seen before, that they knew beforehand that Jonah was running away from God. Before the storm, they knew he was running away from God. That had come up in the conversation. Then this incredible storm comes on the ship to the point where everybody knows that this is the end for all of them. They can't survive this shipwreck, this likely shipwreck. The storm is way too fierce. These are sailors who know the sea. No doubt they've been in storms before, but they know that this storm is unlike any storm that they've been in before. Some of them might have survived horrific storms, but they know this one is different. And then they join things together in their minds. They say, this is a unique storm. Maybe the idea of this guy who's running away from God has brought this storm on us. And then they're in this massive dilemma. This guy is God's man, this powerful God who's bringing the storm, and then he says, throw me over the side. And what do you do? This is stuck in the middle. We throw him over the side and we're throwing God's man over the side and we're in trouble. We don't throw him over the side and the storm carries on and we all die. They are faced with a no-win. And so they follow what Jonah says. They throw him over the side, reluctantly throw him overboard, and the sea calms. That's the context of what's going on around this story. But the whole of chapter 2 is about the conversation that God or Jonah has with God in prayer. What we see, I think, falls into a couple of sections, which I hope it's helpful. I'm going to say we hear cries from the grave. I'm going to say we hear a focus of hope. I'm going to say that we see a source of salvation. They're the three things. First thing we see is cries from the grave. Jonah chapter 2 and verse 2 to 4. This is Jonah. In my distress I called to the Lord and he answered me. From deep in the realm of the dead I called for help, and you listened to my cry. You hurled me into the depths, into the very heart of the sea, and the currents swirled about me. All your waves and breakers swept over me. I said, I've been banished from your sight. The experience we kind of see here, I think, in Jonah's words, one idea that comes really to the fore is this idea that he's been separated from God. He's experiencing a spiritual separation. I am God's man. I know I've been appointed by God. I know I have a mission. But what I experience here is this deep spiritual separation from God. I have been banished from your sight. It's using really ancient world language, where the idea of being in the presence of the king and being banished from the presence of the king was a powerful idea. And Jonah knew that he was, although he wasn't physically in the presence of the king, he knew that as God's prophet, he was in the presence of the king. And he's now saying, what has happened as a result of my rebellion, as a result of my running in the opposite direction, as a result of my refusing to carry out what God has called me to do, I find myself separated, banished from the presence of God. Where is he banished to? He's banished into the sea, into a chaotic sea. If there's one thing that the Hebrews had in their minds was the idea that the sea was a place of chaos and danger. It was a place which they couldn't control. It was a place that you didn't go to. It was representative of God's judgment. So much so, just as an interesting aside, look in Revelation, and what we see portrayed at the end of the Bible is the idea that there is no sea. It's carrying on with this Hebrew idea of the sea is a place of banishment. It's a place where if you're in that place, outside of a boat, you're banished, you're gone. But when we come to the end of the Bible, we see being present with God is no sea. That's what Jonah is saying. I'm thrown into chaos. And I am spiritually and relationally banished from you. I'm separated. I am pushed away. Look at verse 5 and 6. The engulfing waters threatened me. The deep surrounded me. Seaweed was wrapped around my head. To the roots of the mountains I sank down. The earth beneath me barred me in forever. I think there's another aspect that Jonah is talking about here, which is another Hebrew idea. The idea that the sea in its chaotic nature is a separation for human beings from the good creation to the awful creation. What we see portrayed at the beginning of the Bible is God is hovering over the sea. We see that the idea that God brings good by separating the land from the sea and creating a physical context for human beings to enjoy creation. And here we see Jonah, he's now in all of his being That's the idea between these two ways of crying out. Whether you look at him spiritually or whether you look at him as a physical human being, in both of those aspects, he is now, I was going to say all at sea, that's just way too good. He is just done. Spiritually crushed as a living, breathing human being. Everything about him is shattered. One of the great things about the Bible is that it is impossible, I think, to come to the Bible and try to believe that it's some sort of feel-good, ignore-the-pain philosophy. Some sort of idea that the God of the Bible takes you out of yourself, takes you out of your human experience, takes you out of the horrors of this world, takes you onto a different spiritual plane, and allows you to be satisfied in him and separated from everything else. Nothing could be further from the truth in the idea of what the faith in this God of the Bible, as it unfolds over millennia, through the Old Testament and the New Testament, we constantly see that the God of the Bible is intimately connected with the horrors of what it is to live in this physical, desperate, broken world. That's the reality of the Bible. We see it in Jonah. From Jonah to Paul, who's shipwrecked and beaten and imprisoned and ultimately martyred. Right through the Bible, we see that those who are believers in God are not inoculated or separated from the crisis of the reality of the world that we live in. That is a good thing. It's a good thing. Because if we think that the idea of salvation in this God is going to, if I put my faith in this God, it's all going to turn out great. For the rest of my life, it's going to be a beautiful spiritual experience. We're going to be sorely disappointed. We're going to feel as if this God of the Bible has failed us. But what God is also doing at the same time, isn't he? He's speaking into that very brokenness and saying, yes, you're part of that brokenness, but that brokenness is something that troubles me. It's something that I'm concerned about. It's something that I see that our human experience, spiritual separation and creational discontinuity or brokenness, that human experience is what God is speaking to in the story of Jonah and saying you shouldn't be like that as people. You're not made to be like that. You're made to be spiritually fulfilled and you're made to be creationally at rest. And Jonah is almost this being that almost goes to this crushed creation. This broken creation. Is it possible that God can raise the dead and recreate? Can God do that? Can he raise the dead and recreate in this cry from the grave? Against this, and kind of pendulum swinging between the cries from the grave, we also have these incredible moments which is a focus of hope. There's a prophet who's running away from God. He's acknowledged that God is behind his calamity. He said to the sailors, it's because of me, throw me in the sea. He is experiencing spiritual and physical calamity. And yet he still looks to God. Isn't that remarkable? Look at verse 4. After all of that talk about the depths of the sea and all of that kind of thing, look at the end of verse 4. Yet I will look again towards your holy temple. In the middle of his calamity, he's still saying, I'm going to look to you. In the middle of his calamity, he's saying, where am I going to go? Where's my hope? Where is it possible for me to find any hope in the chaos of the sea and in the depths of the grave? I will look again towards your holy temple. Look at verse 6. But you, Lord my God, brought my life up from the pit. Isn't that audacious? Isn't it kind of outrageous? Verse 7. When my life was ebbing away, I remembered you, Lord, and my prayers rose to you, to your holy temple. Here's this guy who knows that he's responsible. He sees his culpability in the situation that he's in. He sees the justice of God, and yet at the same time, he looks to God. Here's the thing I think happens in this moment. It's all about judgment. And it's all about trial. Who's on trial? Because up to these words, Jonah is clearly on trial, isn't he? He knows that he's created the events that's ended up with him underwater. But there's a turn that takes place in these words. Because I would suggest that suddenly God is on trial. The character and nature of God is now at stake. What kind of a God are you? Are you a God who, in my calamity, in my crisis, I know I can still turn to you? In my rebellion, when I recognize the depths to which I have fallen, are you the kind of God that I can still turn to you? Are you the kind of God who I can say, I will look to your holy temple? How far have you run from God? How devastating are your rebellions? How many people have been put in jeopardy because of your decisions? Do you think that your rebellion is greater than the power of the salvation of God? Do you believe that? Do you believe that in all of the history of the world, in all of the rebellion of human beings, that your individual rebellion is so great that it's more powerful than the saving power of God? What Jonah recognizes in that moment, and what he claims and what he asserts by turning to God, is this: what's on test now is your character, is your salvation power, and it's not even a test. I know what you are like. So here's back to our first question. Can God raise the dead? Or even more, can God raise from the dead this rebellious prophet? Can he do that? How do we know he can? Well, Jonah tells us in verse 9. Jonah chapter 2 and verse 9 is the central verse for the whole of the book. And arguably, if the whole of the story of the Bible is about whether God can raise people from the dead, then Jonah chapter 2 and verse 9 is the central theme of the whole of the Bible. Look at verse 9. But I, with shouts of grateful praise. Can you even come to terms with the idea of shouting grateful praise in that chaos-filled environment? With shouts of grateful praise will sacrifice to you what I have vowed I will make good. I will say, salvation comes from the Lord. There's one theme over the whole of this book. It's this: salvation comes from the Lord. It is the central theme for this book. It's the central theme for the Bible. It's everything. It's everything. Salvation comes from the Lord. The source of salvation is played out in chapter 2. It's played out in the 3 days that Jonah is in the grave, effectively. How do we understand what's gone on here? We understand what's gone on here when we see the whole of the Bible unfold. And Jesus uses Jonah as the one prophetic example which he makes abundantly clear that it speaks of him. Matthew chapter 12, verse 38 to 40, he's debating with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, and they said to him, "Teacher, we want to see a miraculous sign from you." He answered, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." That's what this is about. It's about salvation is of the Lord. It's about salvation being worked out. And it's about preparing our hearts and our minds for another 3 days and another grave experience and another raising from the dead. Both are justice written. Jonah receives the punishment and is made alive as he's spat out onto the shore. The Messiah dies and lives again. And what we see almost in this story is it's almost got a split screen. On the one hand, we see what's going on under the water with Jonah, confessing and pleading for salvation and looking to God in hope. And at the same time, on the surface, we see some sailors whose day is transformed from chaos to peace, and who have become worshippers of this God. They've made sacrifices. How is that worked out? How is it that people who had no fear of God, and they had no fear of God when Jonah got on the boat, because when he said, "I'm running away from God," they said, "Yeah, whatever. I don't care. Your God, no big deal. I've seen your gods. In fact, can't even see your God. At least we can see our God. Jump on board, mate. We're off." No worries. Total disregard for this God, the unseen God of the Hebrews, Yahweh. And in a matter of hours in their life, they are totally transformed by seeing the power of God and the salvation of God. What caused their salvation? Somebody dying and going in the grave for 3 days. That's it. Does it sound familiar? It can't be more. It can't be more telegraphing, can it, of what Jesus has done? And Jesus says, just in case you didn't get it, Jonah is all about me. Because those sailors came to faith, came to know my Father because of a prophet who died and was buried and rose again. But actually it was his death that brought them life. They were all dying, but it was his death that brought them life. That is about as loud a scream from the Old Testament as you can possibly get to point you and me today to Jesus. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 4 says this: "Because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive in Christ, even when we were dead in our transgressions. Even when we were dead. That's the point about the sailors on the boat. They looked alive when they dropped their lines and set sail, but they were dead. They were spiritually dead. And yet when a prophet dies, they come spiritually alive and they know God. Because while they were still dead, somebody died for them. Here's something even more remarkable. Ephesians chapter 2 says that experience can be ours today. Because the Christ who died, while we were dead in our transgressions, has died so that we might live. Ephesians 2:5 concludes that idea with this. It's by grace you've been saved. It's almost another way of saying salvation is of the Lord. Salvation is of the Lord could be written a different way, and you could say it's by grace that you've been saved, because salvation can't be anything other than grace. Can't be anything other than grace. So I'm going to come back to our first question. Can God raise the dead? I wouldn't say that this room is full of people who've been raised from the dead. There's a pretty good number who've been raised from the dead. Because while we were dead in our transgressions, while we were enemies of Jesus, he died so that we might live. He died so that we might have spiritual well-being for all of eternity. And he died so that we might have creational peace for all of eternity.